What's in the basket? Easter eggs?
What's in the basket?
Clothes.
Why, hello everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Beyond the Macabre podcast. This is a podcast where I will be diving into the process of what goes into creating horror films, as well as digging deeper into the themes that can be found within them. My name is Drew, and something cool about me is that it is a regular pastime of mine to stuff my family relatives in the wicker baskets. Before we dive into our first film, I want to take the time to explain a little bit about who I am and justify the existence of this podcast. Like I said before, my name is Drew, and I am currently a senior in high school. Ever since the age of 11, I have always had a fascination with the horror genre. Until I was permitted by my parents to watch any scary movies, I would spend hours of my free time on YouTube listening to creepypastas, scary stories, watching horror movie recaps, all without them knowing. And horror since then has become my favorite genre, no matter the medium it's told in. And besides the thrill you get from being scared, I also love it because of how truly weird and out there it can get. The boundaries of what you can show are pushed, and that can result in some incredibly amazing art masterpieces, as well as some beautifully bad pieces, and I love both outcomes. I am creating this podcast because I will be turning my work done on here in for credit as my personal senior project for this school year. For the sake of my project, there will be at least 5 episodes, but if I find that I genuinely enjoy making these and I can find the time for it, there is a chance that I will continue to make more of these after the completion of the initial 5 episodes. I happen to be a big fan of nonstop talking about things that I love, so I think the chances of it continuing after the deadline are likely. But in order to reach the deadline of 5 episodes before the end of the school year, you can expect an average of around 1 episode a month. I am very excited to begin this episode, so let's just dive straight into it. So, when I first decided to start this podcast, I really pondered, and I thought, what would be the best movie to start a horror podcast with? It turns out that's not a very easy question. I could start with something like The Shining. There's so much to talk about within that film, and everybody knows it, but I felt like I would be biting off more than I could chew for a first episode of a kind of format that I have like zero prior experience with. So this circled around in my head for multiple weeks, and I'm trying to come up with a good film that everyone knows that would get people interested in listening to what I have to say. And then I realized I could do the exact opposite. So what if I started the podcast by covering a film that is not mainstream in the slightest and is 100% self-indulgent within my own interests? So that is exactly what I decided to do, and it is with great honor that I am able to introduce everybody listening right now to the film Basket Case. So Basket Case is a grindhouse, exploitation, body horror, black comedy that was written and directed by Frank Henenlotter. It was released in 1982, which predates the Green Day song by 12 years for anyone that cares, but Frank Henenlotter would go on to direct 2 more Basket Case films, as well as the masterpieces Brain Damage and Frankenhooker. Both of those sound amazing, and I need to watch those as soon as possible. Anyway, Basket Case was Henenlotter's debut feature-length film. He once stated that the only reason that he actually wanted to make the film, as obscene and weird as it is, was because he was confident that nobody would want to see it, which is kind of insane in retrospect, considering how big it did get. Nowhere close to something like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, or any of those big horror franchises did, but it still amassed a much larger than anticipated cult following. Basket Case had a budget of around $35,000, and it only takes 1 minute of watching the opening scene to figure that out. The budget was so low, in fact, that they couldn't afford to shoot all at once, so in order to complete the movie, they would use whatever film they could afford, show what was shot to potential investors, get donations with that, and repeat for an entire year. Just this repetitive process that they did just so they can afford more film. There is much more to talk about within the behind the scenes of this film, as well as the content itself. But before we get into the nitty gritty, let's start with a brief summary of the film. Basket Case is the story of Dwayne Bradley, a socially awkward, rundown 20-something-year-old man from Glens Falls, New York. He travels to New York City for an unknown reason and makes a stop at the Hotel Broslin, and it's from there that we learn what Dwayne's true intentions are, as well as what's in the basket. So that is the summary for the people who have not seen the film. And if you have not seen the film, I would recommend stopping listening to this podcast right now and going to check it out for yourself. It is currently available on Tubi and Shudder as of the recording of this episode. I strongly value forming my own opinions on media before consuming any kind of content that may possibly spoil my experience, so I would suggest doing the same. But, with that said, I will be explaining the context for most scenes that happen within the film, so if you haven't seen the movie, you will be able to follow along pretty well regardless. So, what is actually in Dwayne's basket? Well, a giant lump of flesh with a craving for the blood of medical professionals, who has also the need to absolutely destroy everybody's eardrums with the most ungodly scream you have ever heard. Sound warning, by the way. So, what's the point here? Why is Dwayne carrying around a little murder machine? Well, that's because this giant lump of flesh is actually his twin brother Belial. When Dwayne and Belial were born, they were conjoined twins, with Belial being attached to the right side of Dwayne's torso. This unnatural shape killed their mother during birth, causing their father to become an incredibly hateful person to them, refusing to even acknowledge that they were his children sometimes. Eventually, their father came to the decision to find 3 doctors to perform a secret separation surgery on the 2 of them against their will, as nobody else was willing to take the risk of possibly killing them. After the surgery was complete, Dwayne wakes up in his bed Belial-less. Amazingly, Belial survived the surgery, leaving the 2 brothers vengeful. Fueled by anger and resentment, they murdered their father, and after shaking off any suspicions from the police, they spent the rest of their childhood with their aunt, the only person who truly saw the 2 of them as people worth loving until her death. Fast forward to now, and they have decided to finish what they started and track down the doctors who illegally performed the surgery on them with the intent of murdering them. And the storyline of the movie itself follows the brothers going around New York City hunting down the remaining 2 doctors. So more or less, that is the baseline story of Basket Case. However, what I did leave out is how absolutely bonkers this film is outside of its concept. Dude, to name a few things, the acting is horrible. It's bad. It's very bad. Enjoyably bad. It's also incredibly amateurish when it comes to the sets and special effects. But that's probably because most of the props they acquired for the sets was from dumpster diving. And for one of the gore shots that showed the aftermath of Dr. Needleman's death, where he was torn in half, they used leftover pizza that was the set's lunch earlier that day for guts, in which that same pizza was shown being eaten by Dr. Needleman himself earlier in the film. Like I said, it had an incredibly small budget, and they did what they could with it, and hearing about it is honestly incredibly impressive, knowing how little they had and how they made it work. Usually all of these things would culminate into an absolutely dogshit movie that is not even worth giving the time of day to. However, Basket Case is the exception. It's actually all of Basket Case shortcomings that make it so memorable and unique. Let's be honest, if this movie was perfectly shot with a massive budget and with professionally trained actors, the movie wouldn't even have close to an inch of charm that it has. There is a reason MoMA did a restoration of the film negative, and yes, the Museum of Modern Art did a official restoration of Basket Case in 2017. It's one of my favorite horror trivia facts ever. I could spend forever talking about my favorite scenes, lines of dialogue, and everything about this film that is just comical and insane. I want to dive into the themes of this movie and pick it apart because even though this film seems incredibly surface level with its over-the-top, unapologetic gore and sleaze, there is still a good amount to discuss outside of that. When we really analyze the bare bones storyline of Basket Case and seriously take in the story it's trying to tell, removing all the horrible acting, shitty camera shots with strands of hair that are stuck in the lens, taking out the blood, the gore, the stupid looking lump of latex that makes up Belial, we're left with a rather sad story. And a story with themes of alienation because of aspects that were out of the protagonist's control, and how that traumatic childhood causes them to mature as they age, and what kind of people they turn into as a result. Now, I don't like to say that just because somebody had a bad childhood, that immediately makes them cold-blooded killers, but in the Bradley brothers' case, I think that shit was genetic. Their father was absolutely ruthless and went out of his way to hire doctors to illegally separate the twins, fully expecting for Belial or Dwayne to die in the process of the separation, and in fact rooting for that to happen. That's like cartoon levels of evil, bro. And when the twins straight up cut their father in half vertically to get back at him, their aunt had zero problem with this. No issues. So while I do think their upbringing of being completely separated from the rest of the world because of their deformity caused them to have this unbridled anger towards society and people that treat them differently, and as well as the doctors that separated them, it most likely was not the sole reason for why they really like killing. But I digress. They were not mentally sound from the start. We'll put it like that. It's not just unbridled thoughts of murder that the boys are dealing with, though, but rather the biggest theme and conflict between the Bradleys in this film is dealing with sexual desire. This is an absolute sleaze fest of a movie, so it's not too surprising that those themes are in this, but I do appreciate how it's portrayed, even if it is rather crude at points. Even after leaving Glens Falls for New York City, he's still completely isolated from society, since he is still like hidden in the basket for a majority of the runtime of the film, except for the brief moments of killing the doctors he despises. I think it's kind of safe to say that murder has just kind of become a coping mechanism for him. Belial is viewed as a horrific murder machine and nothing else. All of this is even reflected in his name, Belial, which means worthlessness and wickedness in the context of the Bible. Both things that his father viewed him as. But despite this, he still has intelligence. While he can't talk, he can coherently communicate with Dwayne telepathically and hold full conversations to communicate his feelings. Now, when we look at Dwayne and compare the two, he's just a guy. Like, he is a normal looking dude who, despite being awkward sometimes, is able to communicate with other people properly without them screaming and running away. He wasn't a parasite. Belial was the parasite. And this is implied to be at the very core of the conflict that happens between the two. Now, getting back to the actual main conflict that happens within the film, when the Bradleys visit Dr. Needleman's office to stake out the land and figure out a course of action for Belial to murder him that night, Dwayne meets the front desk receptionist, Sharon. She's the one with the awful-looking wig. Fun fact, she was wearing that because actress Terry Susan Smith was in a punk band at the time and had all of her hair shaved off. But anyway, Sharon and Dwayne take a liking to each other, and Dwayne accepts her invite to have her show him around New York City. But before Dwayne accepts this offer, he drops the basket holding Belial next to the front entrance so that he doesn't hear them conversing. We eventually learn why he did this when Dwayne and Sharon share a kiss the next day. Belial, who is back at the hotel room, starts to go apeshit. He turns into stop motion and starts trashing their room. It seems that whenever one of the two brothers experience an extreme emotion, that telepathic connection causes the other brother to feel it as well, and Dwayne's arousal caused Belial to become incredibly upset. His tantrum causes Dwayne to have a sharp headache, so he rushes back to the hotel in order to stop Belial from causing any more damage, abandoning Sharon in the process. We get a scene after all of the commotion has died down, where the two brothers have a moment to talk in the bathroom. It's through this conversation that we get to understand the dynamic between the two characters a bit better. Even though Dwayne is the only one we can hear, it's not too difficult to figure out what they're talking about, with lines like,
"No, I didn't go to Dr. Cutter's. I knew if I told you, you'd get mad. We didn't do anything. She just showed me around, that's all. I'm not deserting you. I just wanted some time for myself."
We also get some more confirmation that murder is in fact a regular hobby for Belial, with lines like,
"Look, I've helped you with everything so far, haven't I? Killing Lifflander was your idea. Coming to New York to get the other two was your idea. All I'm saying is it's been your idea every step of the way. But I've helped you, haven't I? Never desert you, not after all we've been through. You know that.
This confirms that every murder in the film was Belial's idea. It can be inferred from this and his past that murder is in fact become such a dependent coping mechanism for him. Belial, being as small as he is, harbors plenty of hate in his heart, and it can be argued that because of this, he believes that the only way to truly get back at people to make himself feel better is to kill them. And this conversation also confirms a deep fear within Belial that when Dwayne goes out and participates in activities that involve socializing and forming intimate bonds with others, he believes that he's going to lose Dwayne to these other people, the only person who views him as equal and treats him with respect, and this is what causes him to lash out. This new introduction of intimacy into Dwayne's life also happens to cause Belial to attempt having sex twice, and both attempts were very much not consensual and incredibly uncomfortable to watch. His first attempt was with Casey, the hotel prostitute that lives next door, who is played by the best person ever, Beverly Bonner. When doing research for this script, she was consistently like the coolest person in the room in every single commentary, interview, and Q&A I watched. She's iconic. I can't put it in any other way besides that. And if you've seen the film already, you know what I'm talking about. She radiates that energy even outside of the character, and it's great. But Casey's character takes a bit of a different approach than what you would come to expect from a prostitute in a grindhouse film like this. She actually takes on almost a motherly kind of role for Dwayne, something that hasn't been in his life since the death of his mother and aunt. For example, when the two of them are out drinking late and Dwayne gets absolutely hammered, she's the one that takes him home and makes sure he's okay. Despite how she treats Dwayne, though, Belial doesn't take this into account and sneaks into her room through the window and hides in her bed. He doesn't attempt to do anything to her. He more so just looks at her. Dude, I wrote game is game, I guess. Why did I wrote that in the script? I wrote game is game. No, game is not game. No. Unsurprisingly, Casey does not appreciate Belial, so she quickly runs out of her room to get away from him, causing a commotion in the process and waking up the entire hotel. By the time the manager gets there to check out the room, Belial has already made his escape and taken a pair of underwear with him. Now, this interaction is certainly strange, but it will eventually act as the catalyst for Belial's second attempt at sex, which happens to be his attempt on Sharon. After the two brothers murder Dr. Cutter the next day after the Casey incident, Belial sneaks out of the hotel room at night and makes his way to Sharon's apartment. You could question how Belial even knows where she lives, but it's important to remember that he still has a telepathic connection to Dwayne, so it's possible that he was able to feel the way out. This is kind of confirmed with the scene of Belial making his way to Sharon's apartment being symbolized with Dwayne running completely naked on the streets of New York in the freezing cold. They had zero permits, by the way. To shoot this scene, they had to do it super late at night so no one would see this happening, and they would sweep the streets before shooting. And they also had multiple different cars on the side of the street ready for actor Kevin Van Hentenryck to just hop into whenever he was couldn't run anymore, so he could warm up for a second, then get out of the car, and then keep running. The stories behind this movie are crazy, bro. But it's left ambiguous how Dwayne and Belial's telepathic connection actually functions, but that's probably because Henenlotter just didn't care enough to flesh that out, since he thought no one would be watching this anyway. Belial does eventually make it there, and we get a scene that is... well, it certainly exists. So Belial pretty much feels her up while she's asleep, and eventually when she does wake up, Belial, being Belial, kills her. This murder violently wakes up Dwayne, and he immediately realizes what's going on, so he rushes over to her apartment and finds Belial rocking back and forth on her groin, which is very much supposed to be his attempt at intercourse. Hey, I warned you this movie would be fucking weird, man. But this ultimately leads to the final altercation of the film back in their room, where Belial grabs Dwayne by the groin and tackles him into the window, causing the two of them to hold on to the neon sign of the hotel for dear life until eventually they both fall to their deaths. Except they don't die, because there were 2 more films made after this. I haven't seen the other 2, and the original intention was for the 2 of them to die at the end, so for the sake of this episode, I'm just going to say they die. It's simpler that way, and will make the point I'm trying to get across more impactful. So, with all of this laid out on the table, we can understand the character of Belial a lot more than just a giant lump of flesh with a thirst for blood, and that there's actually some depth to him, as well as the dynamic between Dwayne and Belial. Of course, not a lot of depth is in this film, but the fact that there is any at all in the kind of movie that this is kind of cool. I think that's fun. Belial is the outcome of a society that leaves no room for people like him, which as a result has forced him into isolation, driving his thirst for blood to take revenge on the people who have wronged him. This, by collateral, affects Dwayne as well. Despite the fact that they have been separated, Dwayne made the choice to stick by his brother through and through, which has proved to be fine when they were younger, but when they finally go out into the world under the dingy streets of 1980s New York City, their relationship dynamic takes on a much more complicated form than what they were used to, as previously stated with the introductions of relationships and sex. Now, while we have everything in order and it makes sense when we look at it from face value and take it literally, I just want to play with the storyline a little bit. Instead of Dwayne and Belial literally being brothers, let's look at how the story changes when Dwayne is the only main character in the film and Belial is a physical representation for something Dwayne is ashamed of. This can range from any number of things, and I think if you were to say Belial represented a part of Dwayne that he wanted to keep out of sight and away from everyone as much as possible, there could be plenty of evidence for that. But there's a specific idea that I thought of that really has made me view the film through an entirely different light because of it. And that's the idea that, bear with me, Belial represents Dwayne's sexuality, and much more specifically, his homosexuality. Now, there is nothing in the film that hints that Dwayne was secretly gay the whole time, but regardless of that, I still think there is a lot to be said here. To make this work, I want to say that the way we see Belial is through the lens that society at the time would view him. Basket Case released in 1982 and takes place in New York. For some historical context, the New York City Gay Rights Bill wasn't passed until 1986, 4 years after this movie came out. And leading up to the introduction of that bill, there were numerous raids of safe spaces for gay people and hate crimes taking place regularly. All of this, to not even mention, the AIDS epidemic that was going on and that entire can of worms that opened up for the LGBTQ community as a whole. Considering the political climate that could be found at the time, especially within New York, it would make sense to come to the conclusion that if Belial represented Dwayne's homosexuality, it would make sense that he would be portrayed in the film the way that society would view him. A parasite that Dwayne was born with, that his father tried his best to remove, only for it to keep on living. Because you can't simply kill or remove someone's feelings that are a part of them. The most that will happen is the suppression of those feelings, and that's exactly what happens in the film. Dwayne hides away with Belial until he no longer can and adventures out into New York City to get back at the people who wronged him back in his childhood. While doing what? Carrying around a massive basket with Belial inside of it. In this idea of the story, the basket represents Dwayne's suppression of his own sexuality that he has been trained all of his life to keep hidden. This baggage that he's carrying around has started to weigh on him and become increasingly noticeable within his character to the people around him. He becomes known as the guy carrying around the basket, and he gets weird looks from this, adding a whole new meaning to one of the most iconic lines in the film that is said constantly. What's in the basket? This connection doesn't stop there, though, but actually becomes solidified with the introduction of Sharon. Dwayne finally meets somebody who is a woman who is attracted to him. Keep in mind, this is happening to him after 20-something years of isolation. So, in an effort to ditch and suppress his feelings even further, to just be gone with what has been the chained weight on his foot his whole life, he kisses her. And as we all know by now, Belial did not like this, so he stopped him. That's because Belial is still a part of Dwayne, having a visceral reaction to him doing something that goes against who he is as a person. Belial in this scene represents Dwayne's internal conflict over what he's feeling, knowing that he isn't attracted to Sharon, but choosing to ignore that to fit in with everybody else. Fast forward to the end of the film when Belial, does his thing with Sharon. Using this lens, we are accepting that Belial and Dwayne are one and the same, and so I want to look at Belial's actions as Dwayne's actions instead, meaning that we can look at the scene as Dwayne only feeling comfortable showing the side of him to Sharon only when she's asleep, and when she does wake up, he kills her. He can't bear that anybody sees him like this, which is why in the final altercation between the two, he attempts to kill Dwayne, which ultimately ends up killing himself too. Hi, so I'm only thinking of this when I am currently in the editing process for this, but I just want to tack this on because I think it's important anyway. When looking at this movie through the lens of considering the homosexual experience of the 1980s, I think the whole scene of Dwayne sneaking into Casey's room can be explained with, using the idea that Belial is also Dwayne. Could be a representation for Dwayne having feelings of affection towards somebody who is finally showing him genuine respect after so many years of isolation and being suppressed for pretty much his entire life, and him having misguided action in pursuing those feelings of affection further than they were meant to be. I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I feel like when I'm talking about this movie Basket Case and how shallow it kind of is, I think stretching out a little bit like this is perfectly fine. Now, do I think that Frank Henenlotter had the intention of having this kind of depth of subtext in his exploitation grindhouse film? No, not at all. I don't think he even thought about it once. But the connections are absolutely there, and I think it presents an interesting way of telling a story like this when we look at it that way. I think it's also a good thing to mention that more than one scene in this film was shot in a gay bar, so the real world connection is there too if you want to go that far. The entire way that the movie presents itself gets completely turned on its head when we look at it like this, but it still remains consistent with the original themes and topics we discussed earlier. I think the setting also does an incredibly good job of driving home this idea of feeling unsafe around people that the film presents with Dwayne's awkwardness and Belial's murderous intent. The majority of the scenes were shot in Manhattan, and because they had no permits to clear the streets or even hire background actors for outside settings, for example, in one of the opening scenes, there's a shot of a couple just looking at the camera very confused because they were just minding their own business and there's just people shooting a movie. But everything that was shot outside was completely authentic to how New York looked at the time, and it is not pretty. There's no cleansing to make anything look better than it actually was, and the places they shot at were incredibly sleazy, dirty, and dangerous, and this feeling only gets amplified with the use of grainy 16mm film. The environment that this movie was shot in adds a layer of unease to it, adding more to how Dwayne behaves in this new environment with his already existing struggles. So, that was Basket Case. When you graze the surface of this movie, you get the experience that the director intended for you to have. An absurd black comedy film that really isn't to be taken seriously whatsoever, but if you're like me and have a chronic obsession with this movie by seeing it 10 plus times, you find that there's a rather upsetting story of being outcast by society that doesn't come with a good ending. Rather, it comes with a sad, depressing, realistic ending, where people who are shunned for being different are forced to suppress themselves and hide themselves away until it literally kills them. It doesn't look at the good side of it, it looks at the bad side. As time has gone on since the release of this movie, people have become more accepting of others. I don't think it's a hot take to say that Generation Z is probably the most progressive group of people out there, but despite that, there is still plenty of hate and people suffering because of that hate. And I think Basket Case came at it from an interesting approach. Whether you choose to look at it literally or metaphorically, for example, looking at the movie through a lens of the homosexual experience in the 1980s, although Henenlotter, would probably completely deny the intention of having any of this in the film on purpose, it's still there, and once you do see it, you can't unsee it. once again, my name is Drew, and thank you for listening to the very first episode of Beyond the Macabre. All right, hey, unscripted Drew here. I did it. First episode done. This has been on the back of my mind ever since the start of the school year, and now that we're getting back into the second semester, it's time to start doing this. I need to make 4 more of these now. But you know, this is I've been excited about this, but I've also been a little bit spooked about it because this is, like I said, this is the first time I'm doing anything of like a format like this. I've never, I've done analysis of films and media before, and I've talked about stuff like this before, and I've like done assignments of this category in private, but this is my first time of like actually like putting something like this out there for other people to see, and so it's kind of scary, I'm not gonna lie, but I think this is the first episode. It's not going to be great. And I'm not expecting this to be a masterpiece. I'm expecting like a year from now, I'm going to look back on this and think, man, this was dog shit. But for right now, I'm proud of what I did, what I was able to accomplish with this first episode. I have a bunch of ideas that I want to try to implement with the upcoming episodes, maybe having multiple people on the podcast at once. I think that will just add like a whole layer of just, more conversational elements to it instead of me just reading off a script, which is what I did in this episode. Yeah, with that, all I ask from you guys, give me criticism. Give me things that I can do, stuff that I did well, stuff that I didn't do so well, stuff I can improve on. If you have anything to say about anything I can do better on this, please, I want to know, because I want to make this as good as it possibly can be, and I want to do justice to these films that I'm talking about that I love so much, especially Basket Case here. I love this film, and I want to make sure that I am doing justice to any other films that come up as well. But yeah, that's basically all I have to say. Thank you for listening to the very first episode of this, if you made it this far. And yeah, I'll see you guys next month.